Allegedly, it's all been bad. Don't quote him, man. Allegedly. It's all my tabs. Different outfitter. Everybody. Yeah.
This literally works. Takes them from 11 to 12:25.
I didn't say it. You on time. He was just making. Yeah, Jeff, I'll work. Lights on my phone.
It gave me the most condescending look. I had about Bo did. I got defensive. I was looking at.
Because I'm both.
That's fine.
I like that one.
I think
it's fun. It is fun. Yeah. All right, we have prayer requests.
Like you. The Wi-Fi is like as
Bucks today. All right, well, we don't have any prayer requests. Isaiah, would you like to lead us in prayer? Thanks, sir.
Lord, thank you for this day. Lord, thank you for this institution and just allowing us to come here and prepare for the different ministries, Lord, that you prepared for us. Lord, I want to ask that you would just grant this time, Lord, that we would become more wiser, more applicable, not only for our own knowledge, Lord, that we'd be puffed up, but for the ultimately for the service of the church and the proclamation of your gospel. As in all things you pray this. So in Jesus' name.
Point or two. Sharon, thank you. All right, Paul, it's good seeing you, my man.
Hey, man, you ever feel like you died 2 days ago and hadn't had time to lay down somewhere?
It's been a while. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's been a while. All right, so we're gonna run through this and discuss. We'll answer any questions from two of the readings. Then we're going to focus on one of them specifically. Matthew particularly is interested in one. All right, so we got through most of these here. So again, I'm just going over what scholars have pushed back on against Mosaic authorship. We'll have a response to these later. So I'm just covering the bases so far. We briefly mentioned, and I will, as we work through the biblical text starting Tuesday, we will start seeing these two different views of theology emerge. Those are not debated. It's very clear, which we'll explain at the end. I don't think this is a problem, him calling himself the most humble. This is not a problem. This is kind of what Mackenzie brings up in his reading in the Torah as a Mosaic, where he talks about clearly Moses is using at least two sources, the book of the Lord and the book of the covenant. I'm going to share my screen. So sorry, Ted, you got to help me out with that. I forget to do that. There we go.
Thank you for anticipating my question.
Yeah, no worries. All right. I think Selhammer does a fair job on this one, and we'll talk about that one in a bit, and we'll talk about that one at the end as well. So that's sort of important there. All right, and then what do we make? This is Matthew's question from last class period. What do we make about the blessings and curses sections where Moses divides the people up on Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal, which is in Israel proper, if Moses never crossed the Jordan River? So, like, how are they dividing the people in the land of Canaan if they don't cross the land, cross the river in the book of Deuteronomy? So that's another question we'll deal with. And then Moses explains the day will come when the blessings and curses will be given for the mountains. And that's where I'll talk about those, which, again, we'll handle later. All right, so just in case you didn't know, this is where Deuteronomy is given, somewhere in this region, because he's looking down. And then they cross over and take Jericho. Familiar? So that's in this region. And so here is Ebal and Gerizim way up there, which is clearly in Israel, or the land of Canaan. All right. How does Moses know about those mountains if he has never been permitted? And because you did not treat me as holy in the midst of the people of Israel, you shall see the land before you, but you shall not go there into the land I'm giving to the people of Israel. So how does he divide them up if he doesn't go there? All right. That's the questions they'll pose. Why does Exodus through Moses present Moses and his speeches in first person? Moses said, I will turn aside to see this great sight. Whereas Deuteronomy, Moses usually was referenced in third person. This is the blessing which Moses, the man of God, blessed the people of Israel before his death. That's the distinction. Like, he changes first person to third person. Why does Deuteronomy have potentially 5 introductions, which we briefly looked at, did we not already, in here? So that's Reinhard Kratz's argument, which was Tracy McKenzie's doctoral supervisor. So we looked at those. So now we're going to look at these quickly because most people don't hold these anymore, but you have the fragmentary hypothesis, which was popularized by Alexander Geddes and J.S. Potter. Basically, there's larger and smaller sections or fragments that have been brought together and then put into a unified narrative. So that's kind of falling out of favor. Kind of think of jigsaw puzzles. Each little piece represents a different story or a different tradition, and they're put together to create a composite story of various traditions. Vader argues for 40 fragments. I don't know a single person that holds this view anymore because it just kind of fell out of popularity. Of course, it is 20 years old. So, and then they also argue that the Toledot sayings, you read about those in your dictionary article. These are the generations of represent essentially what he argues fragments, different ancient histories that have been brought together to create the form that we know as Genesis, which is interesting because it starts in 2:4, which means that they would argue chapter 1:1 to 2:3 is separate. Genesis 14, where I mentioned that last class period has been described as a riddle, and the chapter seems out of place within the narrative itself, is what they argue. And it contains possibly 3 or more fragments, which is beyond today's conversation. And then there's other fragments that stem from the Abrahamic and Jacob and Joseph novella, which, like, you have the Joseph novella that's just interrupted by the Judah Tamar story. That seems a bit strange. Kind of throws off the flow, maybe. All right, supplementary hypothesis is actually one that Conrad Schmid quasi holds to. And that's just for you, Logan, since you like Conrad so much. This was introduced in 1833 by Ebald, and he argued the Elohist source was the underlay of the Pentateuch as well as Joshua. It was then supplemented by older versions. Later, the J source was added, which is going to be different from Wellhausen. Wellhausen argues for the J first, then the E. And then more recently, Joel Baden, which is, he teaches at Yale, has defined the supplementary hypothesis as, quote, the notion that the text attained its current form through the accretion to original text of secondary insertions, alternative variants, or redactional layers, he goes on to say is ridiculous. I would argue, can't remember how many slides I have with supplementary. I would argue today there is a renewed interest in supplementary hypothesis. Conrad Schmid even argues that there is a large literary block that's been added to. I would argue this is essentially what McKenzie and Selhammer argued for. Would you agree? That Moses is the primary author. That's the main document that has been supplemented. Okay, so essentially we've gone back almost 190 years. We've just regurgitated Ebald's, just throwing away J and E arguments and said Moses plus some. Okay, which we'll critique those in a minute. Got a lot more to go through. All right, the documentary hypothesis. It's worth noting, you got to read Wellhausen to appreciate Wellhausen. It's not fair to throw stones at people's positions if you haven't read it. Does that make sense? It's kind of like when you're in theology class and your professor. When I took theology class, the professor was not a Calvinist, and he would say, this is what John Calvin says. This is what Martin Luther says. This is what so-and-so says. This is what Bavinck says. And you just take it for what he's telling you they said, which is true. I mean, he's a professor. He knew his stuff. It's better to go read them to figure out what they believe and why they believe it. So this comes from an introduction. If you want to get all of his documentary hypothesis, that's 400 pages. I don't think you want to read that, so I didn't require it. And so here he's writing in the 1800s. In my early days studying, I was attracted by the stories of Saul and David, Ahab and Elijah. The discourses of Amos and Isaiah laid strong hold on me, and I read myself well into the prophetic and historical books of the Old Testament, thanks to such aids that were accessible to me. I even considered that I understood them tolerably but at the same time, as troubled with my bad conscience, as if I were beginning with the roof instead of the foundation. For I had no thorough acquaintance with the law, of which I was accustomed to be told that it was the basis and postulate of the whole literature. First of all, who writes like that anymore? That's all right. At last, I took courage and made my way through Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, and even made it through Noble's commentary on these books, but it was in vain that I looked for the light which was to shed from this source on the historical prophetic books. On the contrary, my enjoyment of the latter was marred by the law. It did not bring them any clearer to me or nearer to me, but intruded itself uneasily, like a ghost that makes a noise indeed, but it is not visible and really affects nothing. Even where there were points of contact between them, differences also made themselves felt, and I found it impossible to give candid decision in favor of the priority of the law. Dimly, I began to perceive that throughout there was between them all the difference that separates two wholly distinct worlds. Yet, so far from attaining clear conceptions, I only fell into deeper confusion at last. In the course of a casual visit to Göttingen in the summer of 1867, I learned through Rischel and Karl Heinrich Graf placed the law after the prophets. And almost without knowing the reasons for this hypothesis, I was prepared to accept it. I readily acknowledged to myself the possibility of understanding Hebrew antiquity without the Torah. And so what he's arguing is that he had first started studying Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, the book of the 12, and there are points of contact between that and the law, some. But then when he comes across, particularly Karl Heinrich Graf, that he argues that the law was later than the prophets. And so therefore, it makes sense why much of the law, which is so instrumental in the first 5 books, right? You have Exodus 20 through 24, or 23, you have Leviticus 17 through 26, and Deuteronomy 12 through 26, why those aren't found in prophetic texts. And so you would think if you're going to preach repentance, preach against sin, the prophets are doing, you would use the very words of God from Sinai. He's saying, I don't see the relationship between the two. And so as a result, he moves the Pentateuch sections after most of those 8th century, 9th and 7th century prophets. And that's sort of where it began. All right, so he provided this in a most articulate rejection. And so notice he wrote this in 1878. Very few footnotes, by the way. It's just some man working through the Hebrew text and coming to these conclusions. This series is controlled mostly theological, historical, and literary landscape, even to this day. Even if we don't hold, scholars don't hold to the true classic Bilhausian model, every paper or every presentation, every book, as you read the Theology of Genesis, he even introduces creation account 1 is P, creation account 2 is J. And so he gives you, that's why you have to read that stuff. Because removing those components, there was a lot of good stuff in that essay. But everyone's going to be talking in that line of thinking. So he suggests the Pentateuch was written after the prophets, and this reordered the chronology of the Old Testament. And then, unfortunately, this introduced ways to read prophets. Now people start reading prophets as they aren't full compositions. They're also composites. So this is a cancer. He started off as a genuine intent to understand, and it created a cancer. Because if he's right, and that's what scholars were saying, he's right, then if he's right in this regard, how do we apply it then to other texts? And that's where you see Isaiah get broken into 3 different sources. It's where you have Jeremiah get broken down to 3 different sources, Zechariah into 2 different sources. And so you start seeing this same model, different, there's no J, E, D, and P. It's just, hey, if we think it's this way here, how come it can't be this way in the prophetic literature as well? And that just becomes cancerous because now you are looking for literal divisions in a text that you perceive to be there, or inconsistencies like why is Isaiah distinctly shift to being positivistic in the second part of the book. Maybe because he's a prophet. I don't know. Looking at Matthew. You, particularly you. All right. Here are the four sources. J is Yahwist, which is the German for Yahweh. They don't have a Y. They use the J. The E is the Elohist. That comes from the use of Elohim. Deuteronomy is the D source, and then priestly is the P source. For us, I think, as one who's cut his teeth mainly in Deuteronomy, this is the key because this is a tangible document, right? This is an actual book. And so if you can prove this to be not late, if I understand what I'm saying, to be Mosaic, then everything else falls apart. Does everybody track along? This is the key point, not the others. These are all hypothetical people drawing lines how they see fit. And there's no one agrees. So Michael, who's sitting in today, Michael's writing and he sees this text as a composite of J and P. And then he goes, but maybe P2. And then Joel Baden will say, no, it's J and E and then P. So if we can't agree, then that system doesn't really work. So everybody understand? Now, we may agree on larger sections. Hey, we believe this is J, but over here we could quibble. Well, that says the method's broken. Does that make sense? Like if it works, then we would have a consistent, they would actually have a book called The Documentary Hypothesis Bible. They have one and it's been discredited, but they have one where they say they highlight this is J, this is E. It's definitely not the red letter Bible. It's a different kind of lettering there, but this theory argues that the writing of the Pentateuch was an evolution of material, and as a result, contradictions exist within the biblical accounts. So all the stuff I started with, where they point out these doublets or couplets, these different traditions, they view those as contradictions. Therefore, they must be different sources. Now, I know for all of this has nothing to do with the church. It doesn't. It won't even help you with the church. But every commentary, even the conservative evangelical, even the New American commentary, like the Southern Baptist commentaries, they deal with this. They have to, because they're writing a commentary for the church. And even though someone argues for P or J or E or something, that doesn't, you just can't throw out the baby with the bathwater, because they actually may make a really good point outside of the source divisions. Does everybody understand? Like that Kaminsky essay had some jewels of points in there. It had some amazing points. It also had some trash. But you have to learn to be a reader to such a point that you can say, I don't agree with this. This right here, I mean, I was reading that essay and I stopped what I was doing, went and pulled up an article that I'm working on and quoted that section to go in an article because it's that good. So you have to be able to think critically, read critically, and say, I fundamentally disagree with this. He is 100% correct here. And so you have to learn to see the trees from the forest. You have to be able to discern good from bad. And so my job is to now walk through these sources and do my best to explain them to you, which is about as fun as reading a phone book. Okay, that's about what it's like. Because I really don't hold this position. Though I do appreciate the position, because these aren't stupid people. These are brilliant human beings. Many times, that's why I started with the introduction to Wellhausen. It was someone who wanted to understand the Bible. That was his premise. All right, so they assign, and of course, these dates are his dates. They are no longer this. They basically everything is here. Like we're not even covering new Pentateuchal theory because it's not worth covering. But the first source is the J source, somewhere in the 9th century, 850, 840. The Elohist, who's no longer lives anymore. Scholars have killed the Elohist, except for Joel Baden, Jeffrey Stacker, and Baruch Schwartz. Those are the only three on the planet Earth that continue to say that he's still a real person. And then they argue that at some point, of course, they can't tell us who, these two became one document. So these two documents existed in antiquity, and then someone, and they can't tell me who. You can see my sarcasm. Like you could argue for these two sources, and then somebody somehow found them, put them together into one narrative. Who done it? Joel, who done it? Even writes, I don't know. It's like, yeah, it's not very helpful, buddy. And that happened somewhere around this period of time. This is a hot mess. I can't even get into Deuteronomy to explain all the various theories about Deuteronomy. But we do know in 2 Kings 22, everybody's familiar with 2 Kings 22, the book of the law is found in the temple. Y'all remember? That's in chapter 22, little Josiah, young 18-year-old Josiah. They're cleaning out the temple because his father, Ammon, wasn't a really good dude. His grandfather, who was Josiah's grandfather? Manasseh. What's the good way to describe Manasseh? You don't know much about Manasseh, chapter 21 of 2 Kings? This is a very technical, academic description of Manasseh. Piece of trash. Piece of trash. Sacrificed his own kid. Took Yahweh worship out of the temple. Put statues of Baal and Asherah in the temple. Put cult prostitutes in the temple. I'm not even going to trace out what that is. It ain't good. He reigned for 55 years. In Jerusalem was paganism in the temple that Solomon built. His son reigned 2 years, and then his grandson was Josiah. Ironically, who was Manasseh's father? Does anyone know? Hezekiah. Second most godly king in Israel's history, removing David from the equation, looking at the divided monarchy. So you have a great king, Hezekiah, and his son is a piece of trash. If that offends you, I encourage you to go read 2 Kings 21, and you'll be like, yep, he's probably being kind there. And then you have Ammon and then Josiah. So scholars argue that the book of the law was not found in temple, that Josiah wrote it. He had it commissioned. That's just a standard position. Some people pushed back on that, so they said Hezekiah wrote it. And then now some people have said it was actually a northern document. So in the split monarchy, northern kingdom, that the Levites of the north wrote Deuteronomy. So it was a combative text to this one, these two. Does that make sense? Combative may be the wrong term. These existed. This was the northern document. And when northern Assyria, or when Assyria defeated the northern kingdom in 722, 2 Kings 17, the priests took it, brought it with them to Jerusalem, and it became the official cult text. Cult is not the way we use cult in apologetics. It's the official document of Yahwism. And then the priestly source, and this one actually, of all of them, this one is the one that makes sense. Okay, I don't hold to a priestly editing or redactor, but this one actually makes sense. All right, so I'm gonna give you a terrible analogy. I was 20 years old when I did my first baptism. I was a youth minister, and our pastor was 87 with a pacemaker. Okay, he didn't show me how to baptize them. He just said, "Hey, you know, 5 youth came to the Lord. You get to baptize them." How do you think that went? Terrible, terrible. Yeah, one of them was about my size, and the water was mid-thigh, and couldn't get him under. So I just put my hand in the middle of his chest and pushed him to the bottom of the back. Didn't think through how was I going to get him up. It was a country church, right? They didn't have the bougie built-in seat with the foot holder under the water. You know what I'm talking about. This was like old school, pumping the water from a well. He hit the bottom. I was like, his feet came up, and we were wet. I then did the Lord's Supper, and there was a fan above the "Do this in remembrance of me" table. And so I have my Bible open, the pastor standing there, and I'm talking about the Lord's Supper, and the fan catches a hold of my pages and just starts flipping them. I didn't even remember what chapter I was in. Scrambled. After it was over, he said, and Jeff, that's why I take a paper clip and put it on my pages. I got here, took class with Jerry Barlow, who's now dead. He taught us how to baptize, had a baptistry room over there, learned how to baptize students, practice the Lord's Supper. And guess what he says? He says, And gentlemen, you always want to use a paperclip. It then says, oh, and by the way, there's also a minister's manual on what do you do when someone commits suicide? What do you do when an infant dies? What do you do when you have to do a marriage between non-believers? It's all in that manual. Let's say I had to do my first suicide funeral, which I did years later. Had I not had that manual, I called Archie England. I said, Archie, I just had a church member's son kill himself. What do I need to do for this funeral? And Archie said, this is what you need to do. This is the text you kind of need to look through. These are the things you need to do with the family. He gave me those things. Notice what I'm telling you. All of these things are what? Verbal. Now, that means that old man from 1998 to Jerry Barlow in 2004 are teaching me the same thing, paperclip, but someone taught them 20 years before them. And someone taught people before that, before there was paper clips, to figure out a way to make the pages not flip. Does everybody remember? And so these things really did happen a long time ago, but they've always been by word of mouth. And the same goes when I taught Anthony how to do the Lord's Supper. The same way as I taught Darren to do a funeral. I didn't hand him a minister manual and say, go read it and figure it out. I said, this is how I've done this. And this is how I've done this. It does not change the fact that those things have not been practiced for centuries. It just means they have not been written down. Now, do you understand the priestly source? The priestly source is the argument that they record all things religious, sacrifices, how priests act and function, the role of clean and unclean. They write them down. Their theory is because the temple is destroyed and they have to record it for future Jewish followers because their world is upside down. Terrible analogy. Think of COVID when all things in life changed. We had to change how we taught. We had to change how we learned. We were learning on the fly and we were adapting, but the still same things stayed true. The content never changed. The delivery system changed. And so I'm sympathetic to that view. I don't hold that view, but it does make sense. Because a lot of people who argue for a priestly source will argue a lot of it's very old. And there wasn't a need to write it down because the way Pastor Jerry taught me how to do the Lord's Supper is the same way that I taught my students at Brook Parker. It's the way I taught students here. It's the same truth. It's just all verbal. Okay, does that make sense? I think that's the best way to understand the priestly source. Because no one really argues that religion in Israel started here. I mean, there are some, but I'm not going to let y'all read them. There are limits to what you can read. I'll make your brain erode. All right, so these next ones, a couple of them, you have the epic stories. J and E were independent. They were combined to J and E. Deuteronomy, the Kratz argument. This is a big German word called the Deuteronomium, which means that there was an earlier version of Deuteronomy. And you're going to hear me at the end of this class talk about there was this. No one knows what it is, but there's evidence of that in the text itself. But that doesn't place it here. I place it Mosaic, and then it continues to be added to in pieces. By the way, that's Selhammer's argument. That's exactly Selhammer's argument. Problem with Selhammer's argument is what? He says chapter 33 and 34 were added. Well, once you say 33 and 34 were added, then you open the door to adding however much you want. Okay? And then they argue the priestly is there. All right, so let's go through these real quickly. The Yahwist is a very primitive in religion and understanding of Yahweh. It primarily runs from Genesis 2 through Numbers 22 and 24. There are pieces that are not. J, what we know is that possibly includes his death. So that means they were added. It's created in Judah, which is the south, right, which makes Deuteronomy its competition. And then Deuteronomy comes in and replaces. This is emphasis on closeness. Remember reading in the Theology of Genesis article. Kaminsky says that in Genesis 1, God is transcendent. That's his word. In Genesis 2, God is what? Relational, walking in the garden. He even goes even further and says, God is learning his relationship with Adam and Eve. You remember him saying that? Okay. Again, he didn't pick up on it. He's not a Christian. He's Jewish. He's a Jew, but he's also a faithful Jew in his religion. So you're getting an actual Jewish reading of those texts. And so he makes a good point. I disagree with him, but he makes a good point that God is being shown to be relational in that chapter. He's showing himself to be relational in Genesis 18, right? Those dialogues that are happening. Now, our Christian doctrine class and our systematic theology, we push back on that. But what does he says this time and time again, but the text of the Hebrew Bible says this. You remember him saying that multiple times. And then heavy use of anthropomorphisms, like that means God has hands, legs, feet, stuff like that. And that's a philosophical question, really, outside of our realm. Does God really have a body? Those are questions that's a philosophical question. And I don't know that we can prove whether he does or he doesn't. All right, so we then see the Elohist source. Traces begin with the prophetic movement, allegedly. It's a Northern Kingdom document. And so with the Deuteronomy being a Northern Kingdom document, this one has to be shot dead, right? Does everybody understand? Like this one is sort of like, I don't know if this one exists anymore. They argue it parallels the J source. That's there you have the two creation stories potentially, or you certainly have the couplet stories that keep happening. That Moses speaks to a rock, strikes a rock, familiar. Abraham, hey, this is my sister. And again later, hey, this is my sister. Okay. And then you say it starts with, there it is, Genesis 15, that is Abram. Okay. Emphasis given to Shechem, which is the northern kingdom, Bethel, and the tribes of Joseph, Ephraim and Manasseh, allegedly dated in this weird period. And then it's redacted together. I already told you they can't tell me who, so I don't think it ever happened. So then when you talk about Deuteronomy, this is where I've already told you. It is, and if you've read Deuteronomy, even in English, it's drastically different. It's drastically different. In fact, there's prosaic phrases. It's extremely wordy. It's wordy. It's also paranetic. There are teachings and phrases that aren't just isolated Deuteronomy. They are found throughout Joshua to Kings and in Jeremiah. Does everybody understand that? Next semester, Lord willing, all of you will take Joshua to Kings. It will be the perfect bookend to this class because you will start seeing, and this is why I think you can push back on the documentary hypothesis of Deuteronomy, because they will argue basically Joshua to Kings covers a long period of time, and some of those are late or early. They're old stories, old sources. But how does Rahab and how does Uriah or the Gibeonites use direct quotes from the book of Deuteronomy? I mean, Hebrew phrases, word for word, from Deuteronomy in their mouth. How does 1 Kings 6, 7, 8, and 9 use exact phrases only found in the book of Deuteronomy 12 through 18? The only way that's possible is for Deuteronomy to be what? Before it. Does that make sense? Deuteronomy has to be earlier. It has to be older for those people to be, whoever writes those texts, to be able to say, this is that. Does that make sense? This is yes, this is no. Okay? Yes, Logan.
I guess those who say Deuteronomy is later, they also say those books.
Correct. That's where the part that we're not going to lecture on because it's pretty rogue. I mean, it's unfortunately quite widespread these days. But the most common position today is that all of it is 6th, 5th century. all of it. And that doesn't isolate some of it's old, but what we're looking at and what we're reading, all of it's late.
So you mentioned the Deuteronomy.
Mhm.
You said that's kind of like, that's like faithful, right? You agree with that?
It's faithful.
Or like you said, you agree with that, right?
Yeah, I think that the book has been expanded. Yeah. Yeah. I'm not alone. I mean, that's what Selhammer said.
Yeah.
I mean, that's Selhammer. That's Dan Block. That's Bill Arnold. That's James Robson. That's Gordon McConville. If I asked you, if we left class and we just went and grabbed the other Old Testament professors on campus, we rounded them all up, put them in a room, and I said, give me the 5 most conservative voices on the book of Deuteronomy. Those would be 4 of the 5 they gave. They wouldn't know James Robson because it's a very obscure reference, but they would give you those 4, and then they would give you Eugene Merrill. And Eugene Merrill is the only one that doesn't argue for some form of expansion. And I'm not saying that hyperbole was. Literally to a T. Every one of them would lead with Gordon McConville. It's the first one out of their mouth. They'll all say Selhammer out of their mouth. They'll all say Dan Block because he's like the most famous Old Testament Deuteronomy scholar that's evangelical alive right now. And he's been publishing for the last 5 years in Jets on this topic.
So would this be like something that happened at one time? Or would this be
We'll talk about that in a minute. Yeah. All right. And then God only speaks in chapter 5. Sorry, Matthew, go ahead.
I could have just misunderstood what you said, but you said when you pin down the time of Deuteronomy, where you place Deuteronomy, it can completely dismantle the documentary hypothesis. Why is that? What is stopping people from saying, "Oh, Deuteronomy may be the early source, but these other sources will go back and put in"?
Well, you get to use Deuteronomy against them. Like, it's a wonderful thing. It slides both ways. So, for example, you go read, if you just go read just on the 10 Commandments, Exodus 20, Deuteronomy 5. Which one do you think scholars argue is the oldest?
Probably Deuteronomy.
Deuteronomy 5, which is ridiculous, but they argue it's Deuteronomy 5. When you read the Law and Cabinet, Exodus 32, it's extensive. And then you get 8 verses, 12 verses in chapter 9 of Deuteronomy. Which one do you think they say is older? Deuteronomy 9. So you get to use that against them. They say this text here is older. And so then you get to say, well, if you're already admitting Deuteronomy is older than some of these other texts, I'm arguing on other rationales for it being older, that it functions, that it has to precede Joshua to Kings. Because it's not a debate. It is found in all the books. It's also found in Jeremiah and Zechariah and potentially Ezekiel, but I've not read that book on Ezekiel, Deuteronomy. It does exist, but I haven't read it. And so I think that's how you push back on this, is that it forces you, because what you say is, okay, so the content of Joshua, where would you date that? You ask a critical scholar that. And if they say, well, I don't know, maybe 10th century, maybe, then you have them. Right? Like, you see what I'm saying? If they say Joshua is 10th century, and they're telling me that Deuteronomy is a 722, you now say, well, if Deuteronomy is after, then why are there direct quotes from Deuteronomy and Joshua? That doesn't make sense, because that's not how quotes work. Quotes don't work. You introduce it and then expand it. You actually introduce it in total, cite from it. That's how I'm saying you destroy their argument. Yeah. Have another question? You have a smirk.
Yeah, no, I'm kind of. So with the Deuteronomy, I'm saying I would say this, but couldn't they say, hey, this was early and it was just a small portion?
Yeah. So they argue the Deuteronomy is either 5 through 26 or 12 through 26. They can't figure it out.
But like, then they could also say that the final form would be posted early.
They will say this, which we will talk about. Yeah. All right. Priestly source, I don't think I have to go over this one real closely because I kind of gave you a great example. Derived from legal texts, other material, it's concerned primarily with the worship institutions, genealogies, laws, covenants, holy days, blueprints from holy buildings and instruments. Yes, Benjamin?
So why do the critical scholars say that, or even the analogy you gave earlier about it being an oral tradition that was later written down, if the temple is destroyed and they're in exile, what need do they have to write extensively about a centralized form of worship, especially since after that period is when like the synagogue started to become a thing?
Yeah, I don't know. I will tell you, I think the biggest struggle in academics. Okay, so this is something you need to understand. I don't know that it is not here. It's not really any of the Southern Baptist seminaries. We are encouraged, heavily encouraged to publish. Okay, does that make sense? Other schools, it is not encouraged. It is expected. And what can you write on these topics that hasn't already been written on? Do you know how hard it was to find just generic articles on the theology of Genesis, the theology of Exodus? It took hours of going through EBSCOhost and the library just to find entry-level readings for you guys. Because scholarship now is this, if Keith writes that this text, and Keith is relatively famous, he writes that this text is P, I then have to then find a way to publish so that I'm going to say he's partly right. I think the second part of his argument is wrong, and this is actually P2 because my job depends on it. And a lot of times these people are just making stuff up to get published to keep a job. I got a buddy of mine who teaches at a Catholic institution in Australia, brilliant human being, and he told me flat out over the last few years when I see him every November, he's like, oh, I have to publish to keep my job. And he just can't publish. Like he can't publish he's a born again believer, evangelical believer. He can't publish with Baker or IVP because that's beneath his institution. He has to publish in these German and European publishers just to keep his job. Let that sink in. And he's at a seminary. We publish because we want to publish academics, but also it's beneficial for the church. Most of these people at other places have to publish to keep their job. And that's just not how we function. And so that's one of the reasons why you start seeing this sort of growing and where can I push the limits? Where can I push the argument that's new? And so the new thing is just push everything late. Does that make sense?
Never let the truth get in the way of a good article.
Correct. And so really you start pushing arguments that you may not even agree with just so you can get stuff on your resume, so that you can continue. And then once you start, the way it works is I published this article. It's a little crazy, but I thought it was pretty fun. And they accept it. Then what do you start doing? Just start publishing that same line of thought over and over and over again until you exhaust that line of thought. And then you move to something else. Yeah. I mean, that's an oversimplification. I think that's partly driving this. I really do. One of the new things in scholarship is to attack old, famous, dead dudes. It's not like, when I say dead dudes, because mainly the old ones are all dudes, right? Women started going to PhD programs in the 60s and 70s. So you take those that are dead that can't argue back, and that's all you're doing is you're proving all these famous people, they're wrong. And that's going to get published. It's going to get published every day of the week because you have enough gall to go after the Hall of Fame and call them wrong and then prove them wrong. And then that just resets the standard. Does that make sense? It resets, it recalibrates the whole conversation in those areas. And that forces then people moving forward. Yeah. All right. So I covered that real quickly. This one is, I think Ben asked me this, or someone asked me this at a class the other day. The Israelite traditions approach, you don't ignore the previous slides because a lot of these people still hold to the documentary hypothesis. But what they're arguing for is that the documentary hypothesis is actually driven not by sources, but by traditions. Does everyone understand that? And so that the sources represent traditions, not J and E as in these are different like writers. but there's this tradition of information that's being transferred. Grab your Bibles, turn, if you will, to the book of Deuteronomy. This is just an easy example. We're going to be in chapter 26. And then we'll move quickly past this, and then we'll talk briefly about Deuteronomy, and we'll get our readings from Genesis, because we'll be in Genesis a while. All right, so in Deuteronomy 26. All right. So there are plenty of examples of what I'm about to show you. This is the most famous one. It's mainly famous because a guy wrote a book based off of this that turned into his theology. So when we get to chapter 26, we begin in, sorry, for real. All right. Verse 5, the second part. Notice the first part says, you shall make this response before the Lord your God. So now we're speaking about an oral tradition. So everybody see that? It's commanding we, the people, to say this out loud. So everybody understand? That's how they determine if it's an oral tradition. All right. He begins in second part of verse 5. A wandering Aramean was my ancestor. Who was the wandering Aramean? Jacob. He wandered up into Aramea to get his two wives, Rachel and Leah. Okay. So this is like chanting or reciting your ancient history. A wandering Aramean was my ancestor. He went down into Egypt and lived there as an alien, few in number. And he became a great nation, mighty and populous. That's who? It's Joseph going into the land of Egypt and becoming populous. That gets us up through Exodus chapter 1. So I remember Exodus chapter 1 says, and the Israelites had multiplied exceedingly. Okay? When the Egyptians treated us harshly and afflicted us by imposing hard labor on us, we cried out to the Lord, the God of our ancestors, and the Lord heard our voice and our affliction, our toil and our oppression. That is Exodus 3. And at the burning bush, what does God say to Moses in Exodus 3? For I've heard the cries of my people. All right? From there, it says, the Lord brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, with terrifying display of power and with signs and wonders. That's the plagues, chapters 7 through 13. Is that fair reading? Y'all may not know those chapters. Those are chapters, plagues. All right. And then it says, and he brought us into this place and gave us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey. So this place is also not problematic, but what land is called a land flowing with milk and honey? The land of Canaan, which they're not in yet. But they're on the brink of it. They're on the eastern side of the Jordan looking down into it. So one could argue he's doing that. There's something missing, a big something missing in that reciting of this text. What's missing? It's specifically missing Exodus 19 all the way through Numbers 10, verse 11, when they're at Sinai, when God came out of heaven, revealed himself to all the people, gave the law, gave the second part of the law in Leviticus. It's kind of important. Like, where is Sinai in this text? It goes from deliverance, like it goes from exile to deliverance, which is what's known as the wilderness tradition. And so the scholars, Von Rad and Schmid and others, have argued that there existed two traditions, both true. Von Rad would say both are historically true. There's the Sinai tradition, and there's the wilderness tradition, and that they were brought together to form what we have as the Pentateuch. I like that argument. I don't know that you can prove that argument ever existed, but it certainly proves that at least there are more than this text. There are a lot of texts that seem to suggest that there's this wilderness recordings, and then there's a Sinai recording. And that whenever they were brought together, they created the full Torah as we have. Either way, whether you like that argument or not, or you think I sound crazy, we still have to deal with the fact that why is Sinai not here? Because if there's 2,706 years, the first 5 books recorded, and 1 calendar year is to one event at Sinai, I think it's pretty important. It should be in there, especially since Sinai is so prominent throughout the book of Exodus, and it controls all of Deuteronomy with the word horror. It's kind of important. This is food for thought for later. If Sinai was so important, what mountain is the most important in Israel's history? That's a trick question, by the way. It's a trick question. Michael, you have an answer? Zion, Jerusalem is the most important mountain, is it not? Think about Isaiah theology. It's all about Zion. Think about all the Psalms marching to Zion. Think about all the missionaries, wrong term, the pilgrimages to Zion, all the feasts in Zion. Deuteronomy is talking about all the ways go to Jerusalem to worship God. Never, I don't use absolute language, never are they told to go back to Zion. Ever. I mean, that's a bit weird. It's a bit weird, especially since it's not actually in Egypt proper. Why do they never pilgrimage back to where they first met God? And the theology answer is because the answer is Genesis 12, 1 through 4, the land promised of the future to Abram. And it becomes realized and accomplished and taken in Joshua chapters 6 and following. But if Sinai is such a big deal where God gives the law, and I mean the law based on the text, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, and Deuteronomy, why are they not pilgrimaging back there? Why is Horeb, Sinai such a big deal? I think that also proves 2 different traditions. There's the wilderness tradition getting you to the promised land, and there's the I encountered God tradition. And they've been merged. And out of that comes Joshua. What tradition is now more important? Zion. It's always the most important. It's where God lives. And so Von Rod's book is a theology, and he's making a theological assertion there. But I think he's on something. All right, any questions about that? Also, I apologize. I have now planted the seed. When you read the Bible, you will start seeing that every time. You'll say, why is Sinai not mentioned here? Or why is the wilderness not mentioned here? Because now you have seen the 2 different traditions. And it could be as easy an answer as this. Moses wrote it all, and he chooses to emphasize Sinai when it's Sinai and the wilderness when it's wilderness. That's an easy answer, too. So I'm not denying that's not an easy answer and the correct answer. I'm just saying at times he's emphasizing 2 different things. Which, by the way, what is the wilderness experience explaining? I am God, be obedient. You're not obedient. And Sinai is I'm holy, and you better be holy. So those are 2 different themes as well. So that's one way they can coexist and not be 2 different things. All right. Any questions? I'm gonna stand back up. Ben did ask a really good question. You read often about two things that we believe happened. Let's say we believe is that there's oral traditions, which I believe is true. Like you have oral stories, right? I mean, think about it. If I started out and told you when I was 8 years old, I can still see it. I can still see it in North Louisiana. There's a small little lake, and it's got cypress trees all throughout it. Anybody ever fished on a lake full of cypress trees? And then I'm in an aluminum boat. One false move, you're under. Right? It's me, my dad, and then in the next boat over, my grandfather, 9-fingered Glenn, 9 fingers, and my great grandfather, Paul Cherry. Took our little boats with little 10 horsepower motors, and we puttered out from the camp. We got to the island. There is no island. It's just a clump of cypress trees that forms what looks like an island. And then you wedge your boat through the 2 trees you can get through, and then you pull yourself through the trees, and then you get into a little small pond within the large lake, and you can wear them out. I remember sitting there fishing, and me and my dad were pulling in brim after brim, and my grandfather said, "How are y'all catching so much?" And I told my grandfather and my great grandfather, I said, "Because we're being quiet." My dad told me, "No talking when you're fishing." Do you know, it took me until I was in my late 20s to realize that's a misnomer. Like, I used to go fishing with my buddies and we wouldn't talk. I would just be standing out there. My buddies started talking about, "Bro, we can't be talking out here." Now they got boats playing music. You still reeling them in. I tell that story because when I took my wife fishing for the first time, she caught a fish and she had never known what to do with it. And I grabbed it and I took it off the hook. I grabbed it and I put my hand over the mouth of the brim and I pulled it back so it wouldn't offend me. And then I took out the hook and she said, "How did you know how to do that?" I said, "Because my 9-finger grandfather, Glenn Fudge, taught me that." She'd already heard the story about fishing with Papa Cherry and Papa. And that oral story has truth to it. It has a story behind it where I was fishing. I can still see that day. All the way to the sitting on the banks of the Oconee River in South Georgia, taking off her brim. And I learned how to do it from my grandfather, who learned it from his father. And I'm teaching her how to take a brim off the hook. It's equally true. She never met Glenn, but she will always understand how to take a fish off because of Glenn. That's oral tradition. Oral tradition, the word tradition, you think not real. No, it's very real. And it's the same way we teach our children about Christmas and Easter. And at some point, those traditions were written down. But that's the priestly theory. And you see how they're the same arguments. All right. The second one that's not on here, it is undercompiled, are scribes redactors. Like, we can't find one. I wish we had one that says, I was a scribe back in the day. When we have Ezra, he was a scribe. But we argue that these scribes, this mythical group of people, put this stuff together. But we know between our Bible, our Testament, Old New Testament, we do know that scribes existed. The Dead Sea Scrolls, like, we know those existed. We found where they're making copies of texts, and not just making copies. They're recording the Bible, and then you can see where they make changes in the margins or clarifications. Those are scribes. We know they existed. Seen it with my own 2 eyes. So we assume based on that data that what? There had to be scribes before them. And so that kind of goes to your argument. But most of the conversation that I've wasted this afternoon on, is on these people. We can't tell you who they are. Scribes, authors, compilers. We're just throwing things against the wall to see if they stick. All right. This then moves us into Logan's question, discussion. What do we do with Persian exile and the Torah? Like, what do we do with these arguments, whether it all being late or portions of it being late? So I understand that when I say that, late means closer to us, early. When was the Pentateuch in its present form composed? That's the first question that we can't have an answer to. There are books that say it. I mean, I know there's a book right over there. It says that it was composed in 1426. I mean, that's the date it says. Like, I know what book it is. You're not permitted to read it. All right. So, but he writes it was composed in 1426. That's specific. Okay. What factors compelled the post-exilic community of Israel to assemble and organize all the legislative and narrative materials, elements, into a single word? That's going to get different answers. Should the religious, civil, political, and social background influence our understanding of the formation of the Pentateuch? So take, for example, this is where we'll see how I got 10 minutes, and then we're going to spend some time with Kaminsky. All right. Let's look at Deuteronomy chapter 12 and 5. We will come back to this very thoroughly, so do not fear. I'll unshare. I will keep up that. Sure. All right. So Deuteronomy 12 talks about, notice it'll start in verse 1. these are the statutes and ordinances that you must diligently observe in the land the Lord, the God of your ancestors, has given you to occupy all the days that you live on the earth. Then it tells you go in there and destroy all the pagan sites of worship. That's what it tells you in verses 2 through 4. In fact, he says in verse 4, you shall not worship the Lord your God in such ways. And then in verse 5, it says, but you shall seek the place which the Lord your God will choose out of all your tribes as his habitation to put his name there. We're going to talk about that in depth later. But that phrase, some form of that phrase, is found 18 times in Deuteronomy 12 through 18. Okay? It's also found in chapter 26, and it's also found in the book of Nehemiah. Now, when we read through this section, and I'm not saying Moses did not write it. That is not what I'm saying. Moses is writing, whatever date of Moses we assign to him, he lived either in the mid 1400s or the mid 1200s. He then writes in chapters 14, for example, you bring your tithes to the central sanctuary at the place that God will choose. That's the temple. Solomon built the temple in 956. So Moses is describing an event that is centuries later, how you're supposed to do it. Does that everybody follow along? Well, you're going to enter the land, you're going to conquer the land, you're then going to take a capital city, which he doesn't tell us which one it is. And when you take that capital city, then you bring your tithes to that one location. Now, there's some evidence that there's multiple locations for that. The first one is Shiloh. You got old Samuel over there, right? You got Eli serving. He calls it a shrine, which seems to be where the ark. It's very, never mind. That's next semester. Chapter 16, you are to keep the Passover in that chosen location. Chapter 16 also says that in this chosen location, you shall appoint judges throughout all of your community. But in chapter 17, verses 1 through 8, it says, if a case is too difficult for you, you kick it to the place that God will choose, and there is the judge there. This is envisioning a centralized form of worship and government. That makes no sense in Moses' context. Everybody understand that? Then you get chapter 17, and it says, that we've already read this portion, I think. There will come a day when you'll want a king. That's verse 14. And it says, you may indeed have a king set over you from all the nations, like all the nations around about you, but I will choose that king. And it must be from one of you, not a foreigner. And in 1 Samuel 8, they come to Samuel and they tell him, now appoint for us a king like all the nations around about us, which is a direct quote from this text. Saul is made king in chapter 9. Saul became king around 1050. You take a mid-1200 date of Moses, 200 years must pass before the first king of Israel ever is crowned. That doesn't make sense. And if you take an early date of Moses, 1446, you are now 400 years from your future king. And in chapter 18, 1 through 8, it tells you that all Levites who are priests lose their priestly authority unless they serve at the temple in the chosen location. To put it differently, if we're all ordained in this room, we all have to serve on staff at the same church. If you don't serve on staff at that church, you lose your ordination. That's not until Jerusalem is the capital. And so Deuteronomy, at the bare minimum, is envisioning, this is where hermeneutics interpret the Bible is wonderful. And remember what I told you, it's the foundation, not the house. Just on reading this text, there are three audiences. There's the Mosaic audience. There is the monarchical audience, because you have to have a king and a capital and a temple and priesthood regulations. You follow me? And that's not even to mention all the threats of exile in chapters 28 and 29, which is a third context. That is not saying Moses did not write it, but what I'm saying is, can you imagine being part of those generations for 200 years, wondering when the king's coming, and then you get the king, and now that text has a completely different meaning to you because you now know what a king is. And that's why Deuteronomy is such a complex book. And
If they're saying that it's written either exilic or post-exilic, why wouldn't the Deuteronomic authors be more specific about saying Jerusalem? Like if in Isaiah, you have all these different things, Isaiah is pointing to this longing of Zion. The Psalms definitely are pointing, and we can say that those are written exilic, and they're pointing towards Zion. Why wouldn't the author of Deuteronomy do the same thing? Why is it so vague and leaving it up to?
you want to answer your own question?
I would say it seems you could argue that Moses is speaking prophetic.
We'll cover this in depth in Deuteronomy. I'm going to give you a short answer. If it hurts your feelings or makes you uncomfortable, just wait till April. We'll cover this. Let's start with a weird question. How many of you think, if I go back on the slides where it says they called Abram out of Ur of the Chaldeans, Genesis 11:28. How many of you think that that's potentially been edited to update an old people group that is now known as the Chaldeans? Does that make sense? Because the Chaldeans are a 7th century people. Doesn't make sense. That's 700 years before Moses. Okay. You may not agree with that. That's fine. I mean, several of you raised your hand. So you've now admitted potentially that Genesis 11:28 has been updated. So let's use the analogy, Atlanta. Atlanta is basically central Georgia. It is.
I don't like that.
No, I know you don't like it, but you guys just never know. So Atlanta proper is not real big. I mean the original Atlanta proper, right? So you're driving up, you're not obeying the speed limit on 75 and 85, and then you take the 85 exit, right? And you're on 85, you just passed or you got IKEA on the left. You fought the Earth's turn, you just go around it, and you take the second exit. Second exit is North Druid Hills. I know North Druid Hills. North Druid Hills, right? I mean, you are a 10-minute drive. You just got out of for me, it's like about a 5-minute drive from downtown. Take that exit, you go to the right, you take North Druid Hills. You're no longer in Atlanta proper. You're in Decatur. It's smack dab middle of town. Does everybody understand that? Emory is in Decatur. Best Korean barbecue you ever had is in Decatur downtown. And you know what it's called? Korean barbecue. That's what it's called. But I say that because people who live in Decatur say, I'm from Decatur. But for someone like me, that's just right off downtown Atlanta. And 25 years from now, when Atlanta goes all the way to Cartersville and all the way to Gainesville, downtown Atlanta will incorporate Decatur. For those of you that are geographical locations, I just said 30 miles north of Kennesaw will be in Ackworth, Cartersville will be Atlanta at some point, which is, by the way, is an hour outside of downtown. All the way to Gainesville, which is about an hour and a half outside of town. That will all be at some point part of Metro Atlanta. And yet Decatur is going to be swallowed up in the middle of downtown as it continues to expand, as Buckhead moves further south down 400 toward 85 and 285. And people will forget that was Decatur. And so at some point, they're just going to erase Decatur from the history books and say Emory University, because everybody knows where Emory University is. And that analogy makes sense if you know much about Atlanta. So you guys raised your hands, and I'm going to answer your question this way. I think that Deuteronomy at one point had Jerusalem in the text. And this is evidence that that portion is to be understood as from an exilic audience. I think it's Mosaic. But when you look at 34:10, y'all read this, and you can push back on Selhammer and myself, and that's fun. In verse 10 of chapter 34, never since there has arisen a prophet in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. That cannot be prophetic because it starts with the word never since. And there are 48 prophets mentioned in the Bible, in the Old Testament. Abraham's the first one, so he doesn't count because he's, last time I checked, before Moses. Then Moses, so he's number 2, that makes 47th. So that means 46 have to come past for it to be able to say, this man is more godly and the greatest prophet than any of the others. So Selhammer says this is late. Now he's vague. He won't say how late. Y'all notice that? He's like, I don't know how late. He did say, I mean, it does mean you have to have the other prophets. Well, the last prophet's Malachi. And so either this is prophetic, which is fine, but the grammar of it does not function prophetically. It functions as summative of all that happened before, which means verse 10 is one of the last things written in your Hebrew Bible. That's the only way it can be. If Malachi is your last book, your last writer at 450 to 400, and if you take that this is a summative of all the ones that have already happened, verse 10. Not the chapter, not the book. Verse 10 has to be late. But using my line of argumentation, if you're saying this verse is late, what other texts also have been edited? Because Deuteronomy tells you you must read it every 7 years, corporately. And if we come together corporately, and as things change every 7 years, just look at my profile picture on the internet of the seminary. I had some hair, and my beard was not gray. It was reddish brown. 7 years later, bald as can be, gray as can be, cantankerous as can be. I don't look as happy as I was there. I'm still that happy. But what I would argue then is as it continues, they're able to then not make wholesale changes, update. That presents a phenomenal, interesting discussion about hermeneutics. We ask you in hermeneutics who wrote, when they wrote it, to whom they wrote it, why they wrote it. And now I have a book that we know for a fact has 3 different audiences: Mosaic, monarchical, and post-exilic. Whether Moses wrote it all or not, it still has 3 different audiences, does it not? Because for Mosaic audience, they have no concept of what the monarchy is. They have no concept of what exile is. For the monarchy, they have no concept of the exile until they get pretty close to the exile. But it makes a lot of sense for the monarchy. And it also makes sense for the exiles because they start reading this and like, everything Moses said, we did. No wonder we're here. All right. And that also probably accounts why Deuteronomy is written in third person. Except for chapter 5, which is ironic because he says what? He says, for God made this covenant with me and you, not our ancestors. You can hear that voice of the 10 Commandments for every generation that hears it. All right. You can't prove any of this, but it's not as easy as we've been told. But that's a simple answer. And I'll just give you the article I wrote. You can read it. I think it's the final form. Yeah. And y'all are all welcome to read it. I mean, I'm not ashamed of it. And so those are things that's fine. All right. Then let's look then to the in defense. Okay. This is me pushing back, and there's not as many slides because I've kind of thrown most of them out with, I think it's okay to say Moses used sources. We know he used 2 of them because they're named specifically. Now, granted, one of them was God. It says God wrote it with his finger on 2 sides, and then it says, in case y'all didn't know what 2 sides were, he wrote on one side, turned it over, and wrote on the other side.
Amen on this one.
He knew that there was a couple of Matthews among the ancient Israelites. Explain that to me. Right?
Can you share the screen?
Oh yeah, I got to share the screen. I think that's kind of what's happening here. And by the way, this is what's basically called inductive reasoning. Like we're making inductions here, not deductions, inductive reasonings. All right. I think it's safe to say there are certain sections that have been updated. It happens. Okay. You know, if that offends you, what do you do with Mark chapter 16, verses 9 through 20? What do you do with John chapter 7 and chapter 8? You know, I mean, what do you do with those? They were added later. That is factual. Like there's actual textual evidence that they were added later. That's why there's a footnote that says ancient Greek manuscripts do not include this. And then if you go grab your Greek Bible, it says Codex Vaticanus, Sinaiticus, and Alexandrinus. You know, the three oldest ones. But I digress. I need to do old and new. All right. So there's a difference between Mosaic authorship and Mosaic origin. Most evangelicals are speaking in this tone. Now, the problem with this tone is that Taylor may say Mosaic origin is this, and then I say it's this. Is everybody like Selhammer saying 34 and 35? Locke says these 5 verses. And so Mosaic origin takes on a different meaning. And that's where I think sometimes scholars aren't really honest. I'm calling out our tribe, not Southern Baptist evangelical conservatives. They know that this is a safe word and they use it. And some of them are far more lenient with what they mean by Mosaic origin. And some are more strict, like Selhammer was pretty strict. Mackenzie was not very strict, right? He said, there are all these little stories, but when you step back, it's Mosaic, right? I mean, I'm not picking on him. His argument is just as viable as Selhammer's. It's a educated hypothesis and a pretty darn good one. Okay? These are not the same. Authorship is a claim about a book. Origin is to make a claim about Moses being a source. Now you're going to read in the Deuteronomy sections. It's going to make your head hurt, but it's going to be, I think, hopefully, Lord willing, a transformation of your understanding of texts. It's on Deuteronomy as the voice of Moses, not the words of Moses. Now that comes out of the New Testament argument, right? Is the New Testament recording the words of Jesus or the voice of Jesus? That's a big discussion beyond today. Why does Matthew 5, the Sermon on the Mount, look so much different from Luke 7, Sermon on the Mount? One could be said, these are the words of Jesus. The other one is what? This is the voice of Jesus. That's typically how those New Testament scholars have treated those conservatives. So things to ponder. And then although Moses is the main character of Pentateuch, his voice is not the voice of the narrator. So we're going to talk briefly moving forward where you have a narrator voice. Chapter 2, we saw that, right? And God was walking through the Garden of Eden in the coolness of the day. That's the narrator's voice. And so those are conversations to have. All right, so next class period, we're only going to be in the Bible. I'll spend 5 minutes, 10 minutes going over Kaminsky if you want to ask any questions. Then literally read your stuff. We're going to work through biblical texts. Word of the day, Mosaic origin, 2 words.
Thank you, Jeff.
But